Sword Art Online is the most overrated anime ever made. It's somehow convinced millions of people it's this profound meditation on life, death, trauma, and human connection, when, underneath the black coat, dramatic violin music, and endless edgy monologues, it's mostly just an overpowered wish fulfillment fantasy, wearing a fake mustache and glasses pretending to be deep. Kirito doesn't even feel like a real character. He feels like someone typed cool anime protagonist into ChatGPT and forgot to add flaws, charisma, or an actual personality. The result is a guy who's effortlessly good at everything, rarely loses, barely grows as a person, and somehow becomes the most important human being in every room simply by existing. He's less of a character and more of a feature request. Kirito walks into a room, says 3 words, stares dramatically into the middle distance, and suddenly every girl acts like she's just witnessed the second coming of anime Jesus. Forget having hobbies, interests, or a sense of humor. Apparently, all you need to become irresistible is a long black coat, permanent bedhead, and the emotional range of a Windows screensaver. The funniest part is that the show constantly insists Kirito is this quiet, awkward loner who struggles to connect with people. Really, because from what I'm watching, he has the social gravity of a black hole. Every new character gets pulled into his orbit, whether it makes sense or not. Friends instantly trust him. Rivals instantly respect him. Love interests appear with the regularity of subscription payments. It's like the universe itself has a contractual obligation to remind you every 5 minutes that Kirito is the coolest person to ever install a video game, and that's where the illusion completely falls apart for me. Great protagonists earn admiration through difficult choices, meaningful failures, and genuine growth. Kirito often feels like he starts the race at the finish line, while everyone else is just there to applaud. Instead of asking, "Can he overcome this challenge?" the show usually asks, "How much cooler can we make him this episode?" By the 10th time, the answer is even cooler somehow. The whole thing starts feeling less like a story and more like a never-ending Employee of the Month ceremony for one guy. And that's where the harem becomes genuinely embarrassing. Sword Art Online spends so much time pretending it's this profound, emotionally complex story, yet Kirito collects love interests like he's trying to complete the national Pokédex. Every new arc follows the exact same formula. Introduce a girl with a tragic backstory, have Kirito show up, solve every problem in her life, watch her fall hopelessly in love with him, then quietly move her into storage until the plot remembers she exists 6 episodes later. Rinse, repeat. Congratulations, you've unlocked another member of the Kirito Appreciation Society. At some point, it starts feeling less like romance and more like an assembly line. New girl arrives. Trauma detected. Kirito deploys. Problem solved. Feelings unlocked. Next customer, please. If IKEA made anime harems, this would be the instruction manual. The funny thing is, I don't even dislike harem anime. There are plenty that I genuinely enjoy. The difference is those shows actually own it. They know their harems. They lean into the comedy, the romance, the ridiculous misunderstandings, and all the over-the-top fan service. They don't spend half their runtime acting like they're delivering the next great philosophical masterpiece while secretly running a dating simulator in the background. Sword Art Online wants all the prestige of a serious drama about mortality, trauma, artificial intelligence, and the meaning of human connection. But every time the story starts getting interesting, another girl appears whose primary character trait quickly becomes, wow. Kirito is incredible. It's like the writers were terrified the audience might go 5 episodes without being reminded how unbelievably desirable this guy is. The worst part is that many of these characters actually have interesting setups. They have unique personalities, compelling struggles, and stories that could stand on their own. Then Kirito enters the picture, and suddenly the universe starts revolving around him. Instead of becoming memorable characters in their own right, too many of them end up feeling like satellites orbiting the same black-coated planet. If you're going to make a harem anime, then make a harem anime. There's nothing inherently wrong with that genre. But don't spend the entire series insisting you're telling one of anime's deepest stories, while repeatedly falling back on the same wish fulfillment formula. Sword Art Online wants to have its cake, eat it too, and then have 6 different girls tell Kirito he deserves another slice.
For starters, there's Kirito and Asuna, supposedly one of anime's great romances. If your standards for romance are 2 co-workers aggressively tolerating each other for 5 episodes, and then speedrunning marriage like they're filing taxes together. Their relationship is so badly written it feels like entire episodes are missing. At first, they can barely stand each other. Asuna treats Kirito like an annoying smug loner. Kirito treats everyone like background NPCs. And their chemistry is basically just mutual irritation. which is fine. Enemies to lovers can work. The problem is Sword Art Online skips the lovers part and jumps straight to, let's buy a house in the woods and raise an AI child. Like what? 1 minute they're arguing over boss strategies, and the next minute they're acting like they've been married for 30 years. There's no gradual build-up, no believable emotional progression, no moments where you actually understand why they like each other beyond, well, they're the main boy and main girl, so I guess this has to happen. And the worst part is their relationship kills Asuna as a character. Early on, she's actually competent, one of the strongest players in the game, independent, ruthless, carrying her own weight. Then she falls for Kirito and immediately gets demoted into girlfriend DLC. Suddenly, her entire personality becomes worrying about him, cooking for him, and standing around waiting to be rescued. That cabin episode is where Sword Art Online fully gives up pretending it has standards. You're telling me these two traumatized teenagers trapped in a death game decide the best use of their time is to play house? People are dying every day. The game isn't beaten, and Kirito's like, you know what would help? Domestic roleplay. It feels less like a romance and more like the writer smashing action figures together and making kissing noises. And then, because the relationship was already too absurdly rushed, the show doubles down by making every other girl also in love with Kirito anyway. Which means Asuna isn't even special. She just happened to win the world's saddest contest for blandest boyfriend. Kirito and Asuna aren't a believable couple. They're a plot convenience pretending to be soulmates. Their relationship is basically instant ramen romance. Fast, cheap, and somehow still unsatisfying. And that's the thing nobody ever talks about. Why would Asuna even like Kirito in the first place? Seriously, what exactly is the appeal here? When they first meet, Kirito isn't charming. He's not funny. He's not emotionally open. He's just this smug little edgelord walking around acting like everyone else is beneath him because he beta tested the game for a week. That's his whole personality. He's the guy in every MMO lobby who types LOL noobs and leaves the party after one wipe. And Asuna? At that point, she's already one of the strongest players in Aincrad. She's disciplined, driven, and actually taking the situation seriously. She's out here fighting for survival while Kirito spends half his time acting like human connection is cringe. So what does she even see in him? Because the show never tells you. There's no real moment where Kirito earns her trust emotionally. He doesn't slowly break down her walls. He doesn't reveal some hidden depth that makes her rethink him. He's just rude, dismissive, and weirdly arrogant the entire time. And somehow the show expects you to believe Asuna sees that and goes, wow, this antisocial jerk who acts superior to everyone? That's husband material. It's not even opposites attract. It's just nonsense. The only reason Asuna falls for Kirito is because the plot says she has to. That's it. There's no believable foundation there. The writers basically skipped the part where Kirito becomes likable and just assumed he saved her a few times was enough. And apparently in Sword Art Online, saving someone automatically activates romance flags like it's a dating sim. That's why their relationship feels hollow. It's not built on chemistry. It's built on convenience. Asuna doesn't fall in love with Kirito because of who he is. She falls in love with him because the script looked at the cast list and went, yeah, close enough. And at a certain point, you have to stop pretending this is accidental and just admit what Sword Art Online really is. Blatant wish fulfillment. Because Kirito doesn't feel like a character. He feels like the author's dream version of himself with all the inconvenient parts removed. Think about it. He's socially awkward, kind of standoffish, not especially charismatic, but somehow he's the strongest guy in every room, smarter than everyone around him, cooler than everyone around him, and every girl he meets immediately thinks he's the most fascinating human being alive. That's not storytelling. That's ego fanfiction. And nowhere is that more obvious than with Asuna. Because Asuna isn't written like a believable partner. She's written like a fantasy reward. She's gorgeous, insanely talented, completely devoted, cooks for him, admires him constantly, and treats him like he's some untouchable legend even though half the time he's just standing there being moody. It's like the author sat down and asked, what if the hottest girl in the game thought I was the greatest man alive for doing the bare minimum? And then he built an entire anime around that question. The cooking thing especially is so transparent. Asuna goes from fierce warrior to fantasy housewife almost overnight. One minute she's leading raids, the next she's making sandwiches in a forest cabin for her boyfriend, who spends most of his time staring into the distance like he's carrying the weight of the world when really he just press buttons better than everyone else. So on the nose it's almost funny. And Kirito never really has to earn any of it. That's the key part. He doesn't grow into being worthy of Asuna. He doesn't change as a person. The universe just bends around him and hands him everything he wants. Power, admiration, loyalty, and the perfect girlfriend. That's why the relationship feels so fake. It's not two people choosing each other. It's the story handing the protagonist a trophy and calling it love. Asuna isn't his partner. She's the author's reward for existing. This isn't even sophisticated wish fulfillment. It's not subtle. It's not layered. It's the kind of writing a kid comes up with after watching one anime and deciding, yeah, I can do that too, but better. It's the logic of someone who hasn't learned yet that relationships need build-up, that characters need friction, that cool plus pretty equals romance is not actually storytelling. It's just assembling a checklist and calling it depth. Strong main character? Check. Hot girl who immediately likes him? Check. Everyone respects him for no reason? Check. Emotional moments that feel like they were generated in a lab? Double check. There's no nuance, no restraint, no sense that the story is aware of how artificial it is. It just stacks power fantasies on top of power fantasies and expects you not to notice that nothing underneath is actually holding it up. It's the kind of writing where the protagonist never has to struggle in a meaningful way because the world is too busy applauding him. Even when things go wrong, it's just a setup for him to look cooler later. Even when relationships form, they form instantly, like emotional fast food, no preparation, no seasoning, just immediate gratification. And that's why it reads like something a little kid would think is peak fiction. Because at that stage of imagination, the goal isn't to explore people or ideas. The goal is to win, to be the strongest, to be liked, to be handed everything you want without having to deal with the annoying part where characters actually disagree or change or challenge each other. Sword Art Online never really grows out of that mindset. It just scales it up, adds better animation, dramatic music, and hopes nobody notices that at its core, it's still just, what if I was amazing and everyone loved me for it? And yeah, when you strip away the swords and the hype and the nostalgia, that's exactly what it looks like. A fantasy written by someone who never quite figured out why stories are supposed to be more than wish fulfillment. And if you thought the writing had already hit its lowest point, don't worry. Sword Art Online has a special, what were they thinking bonus round waiting for you. We need to talk about the Suguha subplot, because the show decides, for reasons that still feel medically unexplained, to introduce Kirito's own cousin/sister adjacent character, and then steer the entire story straight into the most uncomfortable romantic misunderstanding possible. And the execution is just baffling. Suguha is written like she's supposed to be a normal emotional counterbalance at first. A grounded character outside the game world. Someone dealing with loneliness, confusion, and complicated family dynamics. Fine, that could work. And then the story immediately derails itself by making her develop romantic feelings for Kirito. Not metaphorical, not vague admiration. Full-on romantic framing, jealousy, emotional turmoil, the whole package. And the question you can't avoid asking is, why is this here? Because it doesn't add depth. It doesn't enhance Kirito. It doesn't explore anything meaningful in a mature way. It just creates an awkward, uncomfortable subplot that feels like it exists purely because someone thought this will add drama, without stopping to think about whether that drama is actually good or just weird. And the worst part is how seriously the show treats it. It's not played as a cautionary tale or a deconstruction or anything that justifies its existence. It's just another emotional obstacle in Kirito's long list of people who are inexplicably attached to him for reasons the script refuses to clearly justify. So instead of character development, you get tonal whiplash. One minute it's VR death games and boss fights. The next it's a deeply uncomfortable emotional detour that makes you question why this storyline even exists in a show that already struggles to manage its main romance. And when it's resolved, it doesn't feel earned or meaningful, it just gets quietly swept aside so the plot can get back to Kirito collecting more admirers like they spawn from loot drops. At that point, it stops feeling like storytelling and starts feeling like the script is just throwing emotional chaos at the wall to see what makes the protagonist look more important. And somehow, that's still not even the most coherent part of the show. And the part that really makes the whole Suguha situation fall apart is that even on its own terms, it doesn't make sense. The show tries to sell this idea that she's been quietly in love with Kirito for years, but then immediately tells you he was basically a shut-in who lived in his own room, barely interacted with anyone, and spent most of his life buried in video games. So the foundation for this supposed deep emotional attachment is already missing before it even starts. They weren't close. They didn't share meaningful moments. There's no established bond that would logically evolve into romantic feelings. At best, what you're shown is distance, awkwardness, and a family dynamic that's more detached than intimate. So where exactly is this love supposed to come from? Because it's not built from connection. It's not built from shared experience. It's not even built from admiration, since Kirito isn't portrayed as someone actively present in her life in any meaningful way. He's absent, emotionally and physically, and yet the story insists she's been carrying these feelings for him for years. Like there was some invisible romance happening off-screen that the audience just forgot to watch. That's the core issue. It's not just that the romance is uncomfortable or poorly timed. It's that it feels unearned in a way that breaks basic character logic. It's the script telling you an emotional reality that the story itself never actually demonstrates. So instead of a believable slow-burn attachment or even a clearly defined emotional conflict, you get this weird contradiction where Suguha's feelings exist in the dialogue, but not in the narrative. And that makes the whole thing feel less like character writing and more like the story is retroactively assigning emotions to fill a plot requirement it didn't properly set up in the first place. At that point, it stops being tragic or complicated and just becomes another example of the show expecting you to accept feelings because the script said so. And this is the moment where the whole thing starts to feel less like a story and more like someone accidentally opened a psychological can of worms they were absolutely not prepared for. Because once you step back and look at the pattern, it raises a really uncomfortable question. What exactly is this narrative even trying to do anymore? Kirito is already the ultimate wish fulfillment protagonist. He's the strongest player, the most respected fighter, the guy every system seems to bend around. The story already hands him power, admiration, and a constantly expanding list of people who inexplicably fall for him after minimal interaction. So when you add Suguha's storyline into that mix, it doesn't feel like a meaningful narrative choice. It feels like escalation for escalation's sake. Like the story is asking, how far can we push the idea that everyone is orbiting this one guy's existence? And that's where it starts to feel unintentionally funny in a really uncomfortable way. Because if Kirito is the author's idealized self-insert fantasy, and the show gives you very little reason to doubt that reading, then the Suguha subplot becomes this weird accidental peak of that logic taken to its most awkward extreme. Not just admiration, not just romance from random strangers in a virtual world, but emotional attachment from someone within his own family circle. Framed through romantic tension, the story clearly doesn't have the maturity to handle. And you're left sitting there thinking, this cannot possibly be what this was meant to communicate, right? Because at a certain point, it stops feeling like dramatic storytelling and starts feeling like the narrative is just stacking proximity to the protagonist as if that alone equals emotional significance. The closer someone is to Kirito, physically or emotionally, the more likely they are to become part of his orbit of admiration, regardless of whether the story actually earns it. And that's what makes it so bizarre. Not even shocking in a meaningful way, just bizarre in a why is this framed like this at all kind of way. So whether or not that was ever the intent, the end result is a story that keeps pushing its own logic of wish fulfillment further and further without ever stopping to ask if there should be limits. And at some point, that question stops being theoretical and starts becoming unavoidable. And that's what makes it so weird. Because if the goal is pure wish fulfillment, and let's be real, Sword Art Online doesn't even try to hide that most of the time. You've got an entire buffet of options that don't instantly make the audience go, wait, why this one? You could have had the classic route. A beautiful supermodel-type character who meets Kirito, and is instantly impressed by his mysterious, brooding gamer aura. You could have gone full industry fantasy with a famous actress who sees something different in him and gets swept up in his quiet intensity. You could have even done the ultramodern version and made it a globally adored idol who falls for the one guy who doesn't treat her like a celebrity. All of those are already standard anime wish fulfillment templates. They're predictable, they're overused, but at least they don't immediately drag the story into uncomfortable territory. But instead, the story chooses the one option that makes everyone pause and throw up in their mouth. It doesn't go outward into some idealized fantasy romance. It goes inward into family, into the closest possible emotional proximity you can get without the story completely breaking its own tone. And that's what makes it so baffling, because nothing about that choice is necessary. It doesn't strengthen Kirito as a character. It doesn't deepen Suguha in a meaningful way. It doesn't add some profound emotional commentary about loneliness or attachment or identity. It just creates discomfort, then expects you to treat that discomfort as drama. And the question, why, hangs over it because there's no narrative payoff that justifies it. If anything, it actively complicates the story in a way that adds nothing except tonal whiplash and awkwardness. So you're left with the only real conclusion the show itself invites you to consider: that this wasn't about what makes the most sense for the story or the characters. It was about pushing the protagonist's emotional centrality to the absolute limit, no matter how strange the direction had to get to achieve it. And that's what makes it feel less like a deliberate storytelling choice, and more like the story ran out of boundaries and just kept going anyway. And at a certain point, the whole thing starts to feel like it wandered into territory it never had the writing skill or tonal control to handle. Because Sword Art Online already struggles with balancing its own identity. It wants to be a high-stakes survival game, a power fantasy, a romance drama, and an emotional character study all at once. And most of the time it just kind of smashes those tones together and hopes they blend on their own. But the Suguha subplot is where that lack of control becomes impossible to ignore. It doesn't feel integrated into the story. It feels imported from a completely different kind of narrative, one that requires a much more careful, deliberate approach to emotional discomfort and character psychology. In a story that actually knows what it's doing, that kind of angle would be handled with restraint, ambiguity, or real thematic purpose. Here it's just there. No build-up that justifies the intensity of it. No narrative framing that gives it meaning beyond shock value. No real exploration of what it says about the characters in a way that connects back to the central story. It just appears, creates tension, and then gets resolved as quickly and cleanly as possible so the plot can move on. And that's why it feels so off. Because instead of feeling like a carefully constructed part of the story, it feels like the show briefly tried to step into a much more complicated emotional register without fully understanding how to navigate it. Like it saw that kind of dramatic material somewhere else, assumed it was just another storytelling tool, and tried to slot it into a framework that wasn't built to support it. The result is tonal dissonance. Not meaningful controversy, not intentional discomfort, just dissonance. The kind that makes you stop engaging with the emotions and start noticing the seams in the writing instead. And once you notice those seams, it becomes hard to unsee them. Because suddenly, the story stops feeling like it's building towards something intentional, and starts feeling like it's borrowing intensity it doesn't know how to pay off. At that point, it's not shocking anymore. It's just structurally awkward. And what makes the Suguha situation even more unintentionally funny is how the story doubles down on the same emotional shortcut twice, just in different disguises. Because it's not just that she develops these intense feelings in her real-life emotional context that already don't feel properly built up. The story also has her meet Kirito again in the game without knowing who he is, and then immediately repeat the same emotional pattern in a different avatar. So now you've got this strange repetition. The same emotional outcome happening in two separate contexts, both with the same underlying problem. There's no real gradual progression. No meaningful buildup of familiarity. No extended sequence of interactions that would normally justify a deep personal attachment forming so quickly. Instead, it's the same structural shortcut again. Introduction, brief interaction, emotional escalation. And because the audience knows the identity twist is coming, every scene becomes less about genuine character interaction and more about waiting for the reveal to catch up to the audience's knowledge. The emotional space that should belong to Suguha's perspective gets overshadowed by dramatic irony, which the story doesn't really use to deepen her character. It mostly uses it to maintain tension until the reveal moment. Then, when the identity twist finally lands, the emotional fallout has to do double duty. It's supposed to resolve one set of feelings while simultaneously recontextualizing another, but neither side has been given enough grounding time to feel fully earned. So instead of a clean emotional payoff or a meaningful exploration of identity and connection, it becomes another example of Sword Art Online compressing relationships into narrative beats. Meet, react, escalate, reveal, resolve. And when that pattern repeats across different characters and contexts, it stops feeling like coincidence and starts feeling like a structural habit of the storytelling itself. And then there's Kirito and Sinan, which is basically Sword Art Online trying to convince you it understands trauma, emotional bonding, and character growth, while demonstrating none of those things in real time. Sinan is actually one of the few characters introduced with a setup that could work. She has trauma, she has fear, she has a specific psychological wound tied to guns and violence. In another story, one that actually cares about pacing and emotional development, that's enough to build a compelling arc around. But then Kirito shows up and immediately starts speedrunning her entire character arc like he's trying to unlock a tutorial achievement. Their relationship is built on the same broken Sword Art Online formula. Kirito enters scene, Kirito demonstrates competence, Kirito becomes the emotional anchor for a character he just met 5 minutes ago, and suddenly that character is fully emotionally dependent on him. Sinan's fear of guns? Solved because Kirito is good at the game. Her trauma? Managed because Kirito says a few vaguely encouraging lines while being Kirito-shaped emotional drywall. Her entire psychological struggle, something that should take time and care to unpack, gets compressed into, this guy is around now, so I guess I'm better. And that's supposed to be development. What makes it worse is that Sinan is positioned as a strong, independent character, at least initially. She's skilled. She's guarded. She's surviving on her own terms. But the moment Kirito enters her storyline, the narrative starts pulling her toward him like he's a gravitational force for unresolved female character arcs. And of course, the romance angle gets thrown in there too, because Sword Art Online can't introduce a female character without the script quietly checking whether she qualifies for Kirito attachment eligibility. It's not that Kirito and Sinan have chemistry. It's that Sinan gets written into the same emotional pipeline as every other character. Meet Kirito, B. Impressed by Kirito, heal through Kirito, orbit Kirito, which turns what should have been a personal, self-contained trauma arc into yet another installment of Kirito collects emotionally damaged characters and fixes them by existing nearby. And the worst part is that it doesn't even feel like Sinan's story is allowed to belong to her. It's constantly reframed as part of Kirito's impact on the world, like her growth is just another stat increase triggered by his presence. So instead of a meaningful relationship or even a believable friendship, you get the same pattern repeating again. A character with potential reduced to another emotional checkpoint in Kirito's ongoing quest to be the most important person in every room he enters. And that's the part that really makes the Sinan arc feel like it's actively forgetting what story it's in. Because on paper, the setup is serious. There's a killer involved. There's danger, stakes, urgency. Sinan is dealing with real trauma, real fear, and a very real psychological block that ties directly into survival situations. Kirito is there for a mission that is literally about stopping someone dangerous before things escalate further. So naturally, the story response is awkward flirting and emotional bonding speedruns. It's like the narrative keeps forgetting it's supposed to be a thriller and not a dating sim that occasionally remembers guns exist. Every serious moment gets undercut by this forced emotional pivot toward Kirito. Instead of letting Sinan's arc breathe as a focused confrontation with her trauma and the external threat she's dealing with, the story keeps redirecting attention toward their relationship development. And not even gradual development, immediate, convenient, emotionally prepackaged bonding. The problem isn't that characters can't connect during high-stakes situations. That's actually very normal in storytelling. The problem is that Sword Art Online keeps treating emotional intimacy like it's the priority. Objective, even when the actual objective is stopping a literal killer. So you get these bizarre tonal overlaps where life or death tension is happening in the background while the foreground is doing the emotional equivalent of, "Wow, you're really strong. I guess I feel different around you." Completely deflates the urgency. And it also cheapens Sanan's arc, because her trauma stops feeling like something she's actively working through and starts feeling like something Kirito is there to solve between boss fights and heartfelt conversations. Instead of her growth being internal and hard-won, it becomes externalized, triggered by proximity to the main character, which is exactly the same structural issue the show has had the entire time, just repackaged with different characters and slightly different emotional aesthetics. And the romance angle just makes it worse, because nothing about their situation calls for it. They are not in a peaceful environment where emotional exploration is the focus. They are not building a long-term relationship through shared life experience. They are in a high-pressure mission involving danger, time sensitivity, and a target that actually matters. So when the story pushes them toward romantic framing anyway, it doesn't feel organic. It feels like the narrative is refusing to prioritize its own stakes in favor of repeating its default pattern. Kirito enters someone's life, Kirito becomes central to their emotional world, and everything else gets reorganized around that fact. At that point, it stops being a romance subplot and starts feeling like the story is mislabeling its own genre mid-arc. And then there's Kirito and Alice Zuberg, which is where Sword Art Online basically looks at all its previous relationship writing problems and says, yeah, we can make this even more emotionally confused. Alice is introduced in Alicization as a character with actual narrative weight. She has identity, ideology, rules she believes in, and a structured world that actually tries, at least initially, to behave like a real system instead of a backdrop for Kirito's personal highlight reel. So naturally, the story slowly starts bending that structure around Kirito again. Their dynamic is framed like it's supposed to be this grand emotional bond built over time, but the execution is still stuck in Sword Art Online's usual habit of compressing relationships into shortcuts. Instead of a gradual, believable shift from conflict to understanding, it becomes Kirito once again functioning as the emotional exception to a character's entire worldview. Alice starts as someone who represents order, discipline, and rigid belief in the system she comes from. That could have been a strong ideological contrast against Kirito, a real clash of perspectives, a situation where both characters are challenged and changed in meaningful ways. But instead of that, the narrative keeps steering her emotional focus toward Kirito as the central axis of her development. He doesn't just become someone she respects. He becomes someone she emotionally orbits. And the story keeps pushing that orbit tighter and tighter until it starts feeling less like ideological transformation and more like the same pattern repeating with a new coat of paint. And of course, the special bond framing kicks in again. Sword Art Online loves this idea that Kirito doesn't just meet people. He defines their emotional trajectory. Every major character he interacts with ends up having their worldview reshaped in a way that conveniently elevates him to a uniquely important position in their life. Alice is no exception. Her complexity doesn't disappear, but it gets steadily redirected so that Kirito becomes the emotional anchor for her confusion, her growth, and her eventual sense of self. And that's the recurring issue. Instead of relationships feeling like two fully realized characters influencing each other, it becomes one character, Kirito, acting as a gravitational center for everyone else's development. So even when Alicization tries to be more ambitious, more philosophical, more structured, it still falls back into the same pattern. Kirito enters a system, Kirito becomes the exception to that system, and the system reorganizes itself emotionally around him. At that point, Alice isn't just a character in her own arc anymore. She's another entry in Sword Art Online's long-running habit of turning every relationship into a variation of the same idea. This person matters because Kirito is involved. And if you strip away all the philosophical framing and deep connection talk, you're left with a much simpler problem. It doesn't actually make sense for Alice to fall in love with Kirito in the first place. Because Alice's entire identity is built inside a system of strict rules, hierarchy, and purpose. She's not written as someone who casually forms attachments based on brief emotional encounters. She's trained, disciplined, and shaped by a world where relationships are structured through duty, not spontaneous romance. Then Kirito shows up and, like always, he's just there. He doesn't enter her life through long-term shared experience. He doesn't grow alongside her in a way that would naturally build intimacy. He doesn't even really operate on the same foundational logic as her world for most of the arc. He's an outsider, dropped into her story, and immediately positioned as an exception to everything she understands. And somehow that exception is supposed to translate into romantic attachment. But there's no real progression that justifies it. No sustained emotional dependency that builds over time. No gradual shift from distrust to personal vulnerability to genuine affection. Just repeated situations where Kirito is framed as important, reliable, and uniquely central to whatever crisis is happening at the moment. And Sword Art Online treats that as enough. But from a character writing standpoint, it isn't. Respect, gratitude, even deep friendship, those all make sense given the circumstances. Alice has reasons to value Kirito as an ally, especially in a chaotic and collapsing world. But romance requires something more specific. It requires sustained personal intimacy, emotional specificity, and a level of mutual exposure that simply isn't earned through the kind of interactions they actually have on screen. Instead, what the story gives is proximity plus narrative emphasis. Kirito is important to the plot, so Alice's emotional gravity shifts toward him. But importance to the plot is not the same thing as emotional compatibility. And that's the core issue with almost every Kirito relationship in Sword Art Online, but it becomes especially obvious here because Alicization is trying so hard to be serious and thoughtful about identity and emotion. The romance doesn't emerge from Alice's character. It gets imposed onto her by the structure of the story. So instead of feeling like a natural conclusion to her development, it feels like another instance of the same pattern repeating. Kirito enters a narrative system, becomes its focal point, and then the system starts rewriting emotional logic around him to justify attachment that was never properly built in the first place. And this is where it actually starts doing damage to Alice as a character, not just the story's romance logic. Because Alice Zuberg's arc in Alicization is one of the few things in Sword Art Online that initially feels like it has real structure. She starts as someone completely bound to a system, literally and ideologically. Her identity is enforced, her beliefs are controlled, and her entire worldview is built on obedience and correctness. The point of her arc is supposed to be about breaking out of that framework, questioning what she's been told, and forming a self that actually belongs to her. That's a strong foundation. That's actual character writing with direction. But then the story starts funneling her emotional resolution toward Kirito. And that's where things go wrong. Because instead of Alice's growth culminating in a fully independent identity, someone who understands herself, her values, and her place in the world, the narrative keeps repositioning Kirito as the emotional endpoint of her journey. Not just a catalyst, but a destination. So her arc slowly gets reframed. What should be an internal transformation becomes partially externalized. Her emotional clarity isn't just about what she chooses to believe anymore. It starts getting tangled with how she feels about Kirito as a person. And that changes the meaning of her development. Instead of Alice learns to define herself outside the system that controlled her, it risks becoming Alice defines herself through the person who helped her escape it. That sounds subtle, but it's a huge difference in storytelling. One is self-actualization. The other is emotional replacement. And the problem is that Sword Art Online keeps doing this across its cast. Characters who begin with strong individual arcs gradually get pulled into Kirito's orbit, where their growth becomes partially measured by their attachment to him. Even when the story doesn't explicitly say, "This is romance," the framing often leans in that direction. Importance, intimacy, emotional priority. So with Alice, what starts as a powerful independence narrative gets diluted. Her identity stops feeling fully self-contained and starts feeling partially defined by her relationship to Kirito's presence in her life. And that undermines what made her interesting in the first place. Because a character like Alice doesn't need Kirito to complete her arc. She needs clarity, agency, and the freedom to arrive at her own conclusions about the world she's been forced to inhabit. Instead, the story keeps suggesting, directly or indirectly, that the most emotionally significant force in her evolution is still him. And once that happens, her arc stops being about becoming her own person and starts feeling like another variation of the same structural issue Sword Art Online never really escapes. Every path eventually leads back to Kirito, even when it really shouldn't. And then there's Silica, which might be one of the clearest examples of Sword Art Online not really understanding how its own emotional writing reads from the outside. Silica is introduced as a young, vulnerable player in a dangerous world, which already sets a specific tone: protection, mentorship, and survival. Kirito steps in, helps her through a traumatic situation, and the story immediately tries to convert that into emotional attachment. But the problem is that nothing about the setup actually supports romance in a meaningful way. The dynamic is structured like a guardian and protected player, not like two people building mutual understanding over time. Kirito is positioned as the rescuer. Silica is positioned as someone being rescued, and the emotional takeaway the story seems to want you to accept is, therefore, feelings develop. Except that emotional leap isn't really built. It's assumed. So instead of feeling like a natural bond forming between two characters, it feels like another instance of Sword Art Online's recurring pattern. Kirito helps someone through a crisis, that person becomes emotionally attached to him, and the narrative treats that attachment as a valid romantic trajectory without properly interrogating whether the foundation is actually there. And in Silica's case, it's especially noticeable because the story doesn't give her enough space to develop independently before it even starts suggesting that kind of emotional direction. She doesn't get a fully established identity or long-term narrative role before being folded into Kirito's orbit. That's what makes it feel off. Not just the direction itself, but the speed and the imbalance. It's another example of the story compressing emotional development into a shortcut. Rescue event equals trust, trust equals admiration. Admiration quietly slides into something the show frames in a more personal way than it has earned. So instead of a meaningful character arc for Silica, you get a brief emotional episode that feels like it's trying to do too much at once, without the narrative space needed to make any of it land properly. And the weirdest part of the Silica episode isn't even the rescue. It's how casually the story expects you to accept the emotional outcome afterward. Because Kirito doesn't just save Silica in some clean heroic sense. He actively uses her as bait in a dangerous situation involving the Titan's Hand Guild. And the show doesn't really soften that choice. It's framed as a calculated risk in a lethal environment where strategy matters more than comfort. So in any grounded version of this story, you'd expect at least some emotional fallout from that. Even if the plan works, you'd expect discomfort, hesitation, anger, confusion, something that acknowledges the fact that, from Silica's perspective, she was placed in a life-threatening situation as part of someone else's strategy. That's a pretty significant trust violation to process, especially in a death game setting where fear and survival are already constant pressures. But Sword Art Online doesn't really engage with that. It just skips straight to the resolution where everything is emotionally clean again, like the ethical implications of the situation evaporated the moment the quest ended. And instead of questioning Kirito's judgment or feeling conflicted about being used in that way, Silica is written as becoming attached to him in a way that the narrative frames as natural admiration, which creates this really strange disconnect between what happened in the scene and how the characters are allowed to emotionally respond to it afterward. Because the logical reaction would include some level of, hey, maybe don't use me as bait in a deadly situation without my input. But Sword Art Online replaces that entire emotional layer with immediate trust and affection, as if competence in a crisis automatically overrides any discomfort about how that competence was applied. So again, it's not just the romance angle that feels off. It's the way the story flattens all emotional consequences into a single predictable outcome. Kirito was effective, therefore everyone feels positively about him. And when every interaction gets resolved through that same equation, the characters stop reacting like individuals and start reacting like they're following the same scripted response to Kirito's presence. Then there's Lisbeth, and honestly, this is one of the cleaner examples of Sword Art Online's Kirito can be rude, and it just doesn't matter writing problem. From the start, Kirito's behavior toward her isn't exactly charming. He's dismissive, blunt to the point of being inconsiderate, and treats her more like a service provider in a game economy than an actual person he's interacting with. Lisbeth is literally trying to do her job as a blacksmith, take pride in her craft, and build something of value. And Kirito comes in acting like a socially detached min-maxer who doesn't realize basic human interaction exists outside stat menus. And the tone of the scene clearly wants you to read him as casually cool or aloof, but from her perspective, he's just kind of rude. Not mysteriously edgy. Just unnecessarily harsh and emotionally flat in a way that would realistically turn most people off immediately. So already, the foundation is shaky. There's no real warmth, no gradual trust building, no meaningful emotional bridge between them at the beginning. Just transactional interaction wrapped in awkward dialogue. But then the story does the Sword Art Online thing again. Kirito ends up being impressive in a gameplay context, helps resolve a problem, and suddenly that competence retroactively gets reframed as personal charm. And Lisbeth's emotional shift follows the same pattern as so many others in the series. The narrative doesn't really show a believable progression from irritation or neutrality into genuine affection. It just skips ahead to the result and expects you to accept that he was useful and competent, naturally evolves into, therefore, emotional attachment, which is where the writing starts to feel repetitive rather than romantic. Because Lisbeth isn't reacting to a complex, layered person she's slowly getting to know. She's reacting to the story's insistence that Kirito's actions automatically carry emotional weight regardless of how he initially presents himself. And that flattens her side of the relationship too. Instead of getting a meaningful arc about pride in her craft, boundaries, or emotional independence, she gets folded into the same pattern. Meet Kirito, experience Kirito's competence, develop feelings for Kirito, and then quietly move to the background once the moment has served its purpose. So even in a situation where Kirito starts off being genuinely kind of abrasive, the story still bends the outcome in the same direction it always does. Not because the relationship feels earned, but because the narrative structure already knows where it wants every female character to end up. And then comes the reveal that really collapses the whole Lisbeth subplot. She didn't even need the money in the first place, which, in theory, could have been an interesting character beat. It could reframe her actions as impulsive pride, boredom, curiosity, or even a desire to test her own skills under pressure. There's a version of the story where that twist adds depth. But in Sword Art Online, it just retroactively drains the entire setup of meaning. Because the initial premise is straightforward. Lisbeth agrees to go on a dangerous adventure with a stranger because she needs compensation for her work and wants to prove herself as a blacksmith. That's a solid, grounded motivation. It gives weight to the risk. It explains why she would step outside her comfort zone and enter a situation that could get her killed in a literal death game. And then the story casually reveals that none of that was actually necessary. So you're left reevaluating everything that came before it. Every moment of tension, every risk, every instance where she's following Kirito into dangerous territory. It all gets reframed as optional. Not because of character choice, but because the script decided the stakes didn't actually matter in hindsight. That's where the writing issue really shows. It undercuts its own setup instead of paying it off. The emotional and narrative cost of the journey gets erased after the fact, which makes the entire arc feel like it's floating without consequence. And it also contributes to the broader Sword Art Online problem where character decisions don't feel fully self-contained. They often exist to get characters into proximity with Kirito, and then once that proximity has served its narrative purpose, the original motivation gets softened, rewritten, or quietly discarded. So instead of Lisbeth's arc feeling like a coherent story about ambition, risk, and self-worth, it ends up feeling like a sequence of events engineered to create a temporary partnership with Kirito, without fully respecting the internal logic that got her there in the first place. And once that pattern becomes familiar, it's hard not to notice how often the story prioritizes momentary interaction over consistent character motivation. And what really makes the Lisbeth situation feel off is the sheer lack of time the story gives them to build anything resembling a real connection. Kirito and Lisbeth barely know each other. Their entire bond is basically formed over the course of a single short adventure and one night of shared gameplay time. That's it. There's no long-term interaction history, no gradual trust building over repeated encounters, no meaningful sequence of moments where you can actually see their relationship evolving in steps that feel human. And yet, the narrative treats that extremely compressed time frame like it carries the weight of something much larger. because what the story implies emotionally is a level of closeness that simply isn't supported by what actually happens on screen. It skips the slow, messy middle part where people learn each other's habits, flaws, and boundaries, and jumps straight to a finished emotional state as if the audience is supposed to fill in the missing pieces themselves. That's where it breaks down. Relationships don't land just because two characters share a dramatic experience together, especially not in a setting where high-stakes encounters are common by default. If every dangerous situation automatically created deep emotional attachment, then every party member in Sword Art Online would be in a constant state of unresolved emotional entanglement with everyone else. But the story selectively applies that logic only when it wants a particular character to become emotionally significant to Kirito. So Lisbeth's arc ends up feeling less like a naturally unfolding connection and more like an accelerated emotional shortcut. The narrative compresses time, skips developmental steps, and then presents the end result as if the audience is expected to accept that a complete bond has formed in the background. And when you strip away the framing, what's left is a very small window of interaction being treated like it represents something far more substantial than it actually does. That gap between what happened and what the story says it means is where the whole thing starts to feel structurally unearned. And the funniest unintended side effect of Sword Art Online's writing style is that it doesn't even stop at the female cast. At some point, the story's obsession with making Kirito the emotional center of every arc starts spilling over into literally every relationship he has, regardless of context, gender, or narrative logic. It's not just girls randomly orbit Kirito anymore. It becomes everyone in the story is structurally required to treat Kirito as the most important person they've ever met. Take Yu-Gi-Oh! In Alicization. On paper, Yu-Gi-Oh! Is supposed to have his own identity, his own goals, and his own emotional journey. He starts as a grounded character with his own history, his own moral framework, and his own struggles within the system he lives in. His arc should be about growth, agency, and confronting the world he's been confined to. But because this is Sword Art Online, Kirito arrives and instantly becomes the gravitational center of that arc. Their relationship is framed as deep, emotional, and transformative, but the writing often pushes it in a direction where Yu-Gi-Oh's development becomes heavily intertwined with Kirito's presence, as if Kirito is the primary catalyst for every major emotional shift Yu-Gi-Oh experiences. And that's where the comedy of repetition kicks in, because the same structural issue that affects the harem dynamic starts appearing in what should be a platonic, brotherly bond. One character consistently positioned as the emotional anchor, the solver of internal conflict, the person around whom everyone else's growth is defined. So even when the story isn't trying to write romance at all, it still ends up producing the same feeling, characters becoming intensely centered on Kirito in ways that feel disproportionate to the actual amount of shared experience on screen. Creates this accidental pattern where Kirito isn't just the protagonist of his own story. He's functionally the protagonist of everyone else's emotional arc too. And once you notice that, it stops being about romance entirely and starts feeling like a structural habit. Every major character relationship, no matter the type, gets filtered through the same lens of Kirito as the ultimate emotional reference point. At that stage, it doesn't matter whether it's friendship, admiration, rivalry, or trust. The narrative keeps assigning Kirito the same role in every dynamic, the person everyone else's development orbits around. And that's where the unintended humor comes in, because the story keeps trying to present these relationships as unique and meaningful, while also building them on the exact same emotional blueprint every single time. At a certain point, it stops feeling like coincidence and starts feeling like a writing limitation. Because across Sword Art Online's entire cast, there's this repeating pattern where almost every major character interaction with Kirito gets pushed toward emotional intensity, even when the situation doesn't naturally call for it. Not just admiration, not just respect, but this consistent escalation toward personal attachment as the default endpoint of the relationship. And the issue isn't that characters can't form bonds with the protagonist. That's normal in any story. The issue is that the story rarely lets those bonds stay in a more grounded space. Platonic connection, professional respect, or simple camaraderie almost always gets intensified into something more emotionally consuming than the setup really supports. It creates this sense that the narrative has a very narrow relationship vocabulary. Kirito meets someone, Kirito helps them, Kirito proves competence under pressure, and then the emotional outcome is pre-decided. This person now has a deep personal fixation on him. What's missing is variation. Not every meaningful relationship needs to escalate. Not every character needs to experience the same level of emotional dependency or reverence. A well-written world has people who meet the protagonist, acknowledge their role, and then continue existing as fully independent characters without their entire emotional trajectory being reoriented around him. But Sword Art Online rarely does that. Instead, it keeps reusing the same emotional outcome regardless of context. Different characters, different arcs, different settings, same result. And that's what makes it feel less like intentional storytelling and more like a structural habit. The narrative doesn't seem interested in exploring different kinds of relationships with Kirito. It's mostly interested in one specific dynamic and repeating it with slight variations. Kirito as the central emotional anchor and everyone else as someone whose feelings intensify around his presence. So over time, it stops feeling like a diverse cast of characters reacting to a shared world and starts feeling like a series of variations on the same relational template. And when a story can't meaningfully vary how its characters relate to its protagonist, it inevitably starts to feel like those relationships aren't being written for the sake of the characters themselves, but for the sake of reinforcing the protagonist's centrality to everything that happens around him. And at a certain point, it starts to feel like Kirito isn't just written to be admired by the characters in the story. He's written to be admired by the audience too. Not in a subtle way either. It's very direct. The framing, the reactions, the music cues, the way other characters talk about him. It all consistently pushes the idea that Kirito is exceptional in a way that you're supposed to immediately recognize and accept. He doesn't just succeed in situations, he defines them. He doesn't just stand out. The world orbits him. And that's where the design starts to feel less like characterization and more like construction. Kirito isn't really written as a flawed person you gradually come to understand. He's written as a pre-approved conclusion. This is the guy, this is the ideal, this is the one everyone responds to. So when other characters react to him with admiration, trust, or emotional attachment, it's not just about their personalities. It doubles as audience signaling. The story is constantly reinforcing how you are meant to interpret him by showing you how everyone else does. That's why it feels so repetitive. The same emotional reaction keeps getting mirrored across the cast because it's also being mirrored back at the viewer. The narrative isn't just telling you Kirito is important to them. It's trying to make that importance feel self-evident to you as well. And the problem is that this approach only works when the character has enough depth to justify that level of framing. When there's enough contradiction, vulnerability, and development to make the admiration feel earned. But when the writing leans too heavily on constant validation, competence, praise, admiration, effortless success, it stops feeling like discovery and starts feeling like instruction. This is why the comparison to mythic or legendary figures comes up so often. Characters like that aren't just good at things, they're positioned as idealized endpoints of human traits. But those figures usually exist in stories where they are distant, symbolic, or intentionally larger than life in a way that isn't trying to mimic everyday emotional realism. Kirito, on the other hand, is placed in situations that are supposed to feel personal, intimate, and emotionally grounded, while still being framed with that same level of near-universal admiration. So you end up in this strange middle space where the story is trying to make him feel both relatable and universally desirable at the same time. And instead of balancing those two goals, it often just defaults to reinforcing desirability through repetition. More characters impressed, more characters attached, more characters emotionally centered around him. Which is why, over time, it can start to feel like the narrative isn't just telling a story about Kirito. It's trying to train the viewer on how to see him. And that's where the disconnect becomes impossible to ignore. The story is constantly telling you Kirito is extraordinary, but the actual character writing doesn't always support that level of reverence. Because if you strip away the framing, Kirito isn't really built like some mythic figure or larger-than-life legend. He's not Superman or Zeus. He's not a complex strategist with deep ideological contradictions. He's not even especially interesting in how he talks or makes decisions. Most of the time, he's just a fairly quiet, socially withdrawn guy who happens to be good at the game he plays. And that's fine as a starting point. There's nothing wrong with a grounded protagonist. But Sword Art Online doesn't treat him like a grounded protagonist. It treats him like an exceptional one in almost every emotional and narrative context he enters. So there's this constant mismatch between presentation and substance. The presentation says, this person is uniquely important, emotionally magnetic, and central to everyone's development. The substance says, this is a competent player who often solves problems because the plot needs them solved. And that gap is what creates the frustration. Because when a story elevates a character to near-mythic importance, you expect the writing to reinforce that through layered characterization, through difficult choices, internal conflict, meaningful sacrifice, or at least some consistent sense of cost or limitation. But Kirito's exceptional status often comes less from demonstrated depth and more from how other characters react to him. He's framed upward by the world around him rather than built upward by his own narrative complexity. That's why the admiration starts to feel unearned. Not because he never does anything impressive, but because the story rarely shows why those moments should translate into the kind of emotional centrality he receives from basically everyone he meets. So instead of feeling like a fully realized character who gradually earns recognition, he starts to feel like a fixed point the story uses to organize everyone else's emotional responses. And once you notice that pattern, it becomes harder to see him as an extraordinary person in universe, and easier to see him as a narrative anchor the writing refuses to move away from. And this is where the debate gets a little surreal, because some fans will genuinely insist Sword Art Online isn't a harem anime. But if you look at how it actually functions on screen, the question kind of answers itself. If it walks like a harem and repeatedly produces the same relationship structure like a harem, then at some point you have to ask what label people are trying to avoid and why. Because regardless of genre branding or what the author says in interviews, the pattern is extremely consistent. Kirito is placed at the center of a rotating cast of female characters, many of whom are introduced through emotionally intense or life-threatening situations, form immediate or accelerated bonds with him, and then have those bonds framed in a deeply personal, often romantic-coded way even when the setup barely supports it. It's not about whether every single character is actively competing for him in a literal harem contest sense. That's a very narrow definition that fans sometimes cling to in order to reject the label. But in practice, the structure still produces the same outcome. Multiple female characters whose emotional arcs repeatedly converge on the same protagonist. And that's what people are reacting to when they call it a harem anime. Not a technical checklist of tropes, but the lived experience of watching the story repeatedly center Kirito as the emotional endpoint of a large portion of its cast. So if someone insists it isn't a harem, the natural follow-up question becomes, what alternative description actually fits the pattern better? Because it isn't a grounded ensemble story where relationships develop independently across the cast. It isn't a balanced romance where emotional attention is distributed meaningfully. And it isn't a story where side characters maintain full narrative autonomy without being pulled into the protagonist's orbit. Instead, it consistently returns to the same structural idea. Kirito as the focal point, and a recurring set of characters whose most significant emotional development is tied to his presence in their lives. You can call that something else if you want, but it starts to become a labeling exercise more than a descriptive one. Because whatever you call it, the underlying dynamic doesn't really change. And that's why the disagreement often feels less like a genuine genre debate and more like people arguing over whether the word harem is allowed to describe a pattern they can clearly see happening on screen. At the end of the day, a lot of the debate around Sword Art Online gets way more complicated than it needs to be, because the simplest answer is also the least controversial one. The writing is just inconsistent. Not in a one bad arc way, and not in a missed opportunity way either. It's a structural problem. The story constantly introduces interesting setups, death game survival tension, psychological trauma, identity in virtual worlds, moral consequences of action, but then resolves them in ways that feel rushed, simplified, or redirected toward whatever keeps Kirito at the center of attention. So instead of ideas being fully explored, they tend to get collapsed into outcomes that prioritize momentum over depth. Emotional arcs are compressed. Character conflicts are resolved too quickly. Stakes are often introduced and then softened just as fast. And the result is a story that frequently feels like it's moving through its own potential rather than actually committing to it. That's also where the harem discussion comes in. Whether someone likes or dislikes that label, the pattern people are reacting to is still there, repeated emotional convergence onto. The same protagonist with relationships that often escalate faster than the storytelling has earned. And when those two issues combine, thin emotional development and repetitive relational structure, it creates a feeling of sameness across arcs. Different characters, different settings, different conflicts, but similar emotional outcomes and similar narrative roles for Kirito within those outcomes. That's why the criticism often sounds harsher than just, "I didn't like it." It's not just about taste. It's about repetition without variation, setup without payoff, and emotional beats that feel familiar not because they're resonant, but because they follow a predictable pattern. None of that means people can't enjoy it. Plenty of viewers do, for different reasons: world-building ideas, action sequences, nostalgia, character designs, or specific arcs that land better than others. But from a purely writing-focused perspective, it's understandable why others walk away feeling like the story doesn't fully deliver on what it repeatedly sets up. So whether you call it a harem or not isn't really the core issue. The bigger critique is simpler. It often feels like the story has strong ideas, but not always the discipline to develop them into something consistently satisfying. If you're specifically looking for a harem story that actually understands what it's doing, the quintessential quintuplets is a pretty solid place to start, especially compared to something like Sword Art Online, where the harem elements feel more like accidental side effects than a structured premise. Because here, the entire setup is honest from the beginning. It knows exactly what it is. 5 girls, 1 guy, and a long-form romantic mystery built around emotional development, compatibility, and gradual payoff. There's no pretending that romance isn't the core of the story. Commits to it. What makes it work better is that the relationships actually have time to breathe. The protagonist isn't just passively admired by everyone he meets because the plot says so. Instead, each girl has her own personality, motivations, flaws, and emotional arc that exists independently of him. The story actually lets them be people first, love interests second. And more importantly, the progression is slow enough that the romantic tension feels earned. There are misunderstandings, emotional setbacks, moments of genuine connection, and enough shared experiences that when feelings do develop, they don't feel like they appeared out of nowhere just because the script needed them to. Even the harem aspect is handled with more structure than most people expect. It isn't just random affection being distributed to the protagonist like loot drops. It's a competitive emotional narrative where each relationship is explored with enough consistency that you can actually understand why different characters feel the way they do, even if you end up rooting for different outcomes. Compared to Sword Art Online's approach, where romantic attachments often feel compressed, externally triggered, or tied to momentary crisis situations, the quintessential quintuplets actually treats emotional development as something that takes time and repetition. And that makes a huge difference, because even if you don't end up liking every character or every outcome, you can at least see the logic of the relationships unfolding. The story respects the idea that feelings are built, not assigned. So if someone is looking for a harem series where the romance is the point rather than a byproduct of the protagonist's presence, this is one of the cleaner examples of how to actually structure that kind of story without everything collapsing into the same repetitive emotional pattern. One reason Rent-A-Girlfriend can feel more entertaining than Sword Art Online, at least for some viewers, is that it fully commits to its own awkward chaos instead of trying to balance multiple tones at once. Sword Art Online often presents itself as a serious action story with high stakes, dramatic romance, and emotional arcs that are meant to feel meaningful and weighty. Because of that, it has to maintain a certain level of seriousness even when the relationships or situations start to feel rushed or overly convenient. The tone stays locked in, which can make its more repetitive patterns feel easier to notice over time. Rent-A-Girlfriend, on the other hand, leans heavily into discomfort, bad decisions, and social cringe as its main source of entertainment. It doesn't really hide the fact that the situations are messy or exaggerated. Instead, it stretches them out and makes the awkwardness the point. Characters spiral, misunderstand each other, and double down on bad choices in a way that is clearly designed to be frustrating but also funny and engaging. That difference in intent changes the viewing experience. Sword Art Online is trying to make you invest in emotional escalation, while Rent-A-Girlfriend is often built around prolonging emotional tension and social failure for comedic effect. So even when things get ridiculous, it still feels consistent with what the show is trying to be. In that sense, entertaining depends on what you enjoy watching. One is aiming for dramatic immersion, while the other often leans into situational chaos and embarrassment as the main attraction. And if someone enjoys watching things go completely wrong in slow motion, Rent a Girlfriend naturally leans into that space more openly than Sword Art Online does. If you want a harem anime that actually understands the assignment and isn't pretending to be something else half the time, To Love Ru is kind of the opposite of Sword Art Online in the best possible way. It knows exactly what it is, and it stops trying to convince you its high philosophy about relationships or trauma or identity. There's no confusion about priorities. The show is built around romantic chaos, misunderstandings, and a constantly expanding cast of girls getting pulled into absurd situations with a protagonist who is way too normal to handle any of it. And because it commits fully to that tone, it doesn't feel like it's breaking itself trying to justify emotional outcomes that don't fit the setup. Unlike Sword Art Online, where relationships often feel like they're being generated by narrative necessity, To Love Ru thrives on exaggeration and comedic escalation. The attraction dynamics are not disguised as deep emotional breakthroughs. They're played openly as comedy, chaos, and over-the-top romantic tension. That honesty actually makes it more consistent. The protagonist, Kirito, isn't framed as some untouchable perfect figure that everyone inevitably gravitates toward because the story says so. Instead, he's constantly overwhelmed, confused, and reacting to situations far beyond his control. That alone makes the harem structure feel more balanced, because the humor comes from the imbalance itself rather than pretending it isn't there. And importantly, the girls don't feel like they're all following the same emotional script. They have distinct personalities, different styles of affection, and different ways of interacting with the chaos around them. The show leans into variety instead of funneling everyone toward the same emotional endpoint. Compared to Sword Art Online's tendency to compress relationships into rapid emotional escalation tied to Kirito's presence, To Love Ru stretches out the dynamic into something episodic and reactive. It's not trying to sell you a carefully engineered romance arc every time two characters interact. It's building a rotating situation comedy where attraction, embarrassment, and misunderstanding are the main engine. That's why it works better as a harem experience. It isn't pretending the structure is something deeper than it is. It embraces the genre fully, uses it for comedy and fan service without overloading it with forced emotional weight, and lets the characters exist in a space where chaos is the point rather than a narrative flaw. So if Sword Art Online feels like a story constantly trying to justify why everyone revolves around its protagonist, To Love Ru is the opposite. It doesn't justify anything. It just leans into the mess and lets it be fun. If you're comparing harem anime that actually commit to their genre versus something like Sword Art Online constantly tripping over its own tone, High School DxD is another example that at least knows exactly what it's doing and doesn't waste time pretending otherwise. From the start, it's upfront about being a supernatural battle harem series where romance, fan service, and escalating chaos are part of the core identity, not something awkwardly stapled onto a different genre. That clarity matters, because it means the show never has to awkwardly justify why relationships are happening or pretend they're subtle emotional inevitabilities. The protagonist, Issei, is not framed as some emotionally distant, effortlessly admired figure who everyone gravitates toward because the narrative demands it. He's loud, flawed, perverted, ambitious in a very direct way, and constantly reacting to situations that are way bigger than him. And crucially, his relationships don't feel like they're being handed to him as predetermined outcomes. They're built through interaction, shared struggle, loyalty, and repeated involvement in the same chaotic world. What makes High School DxD work better as a harem structure is that the harem element is actually acknowledged and integrated into the story's logic. The characters aren't subtly funneled into the same emotional endpoint without friction. Instead, there's ongoing tension, competition, jealousy, teamwork, and development that unfolds over time rather than being compressed into single-episode emotional conversions. And unlike Sword Art Online, where romance often feels like it overrides or interrupts the main stakes, DxD lets its tone stay consistent. If it's a battle arc, it stays a battle arc. If it's character bonding, it's still filtered through the show's established energy. It doesn't suddenly pretend it's a grounded psychological romance drama in the middle of an over-the-top supernatural conflict. Even the relationships themselves are more structurally coherent. The characters around Issei don't all respond to him in the same uniform way. Their feelings develop differently at different speeds and with different motivations, which makes the overall dynamic feel more like a messy but believable ecosystem rather than a scripted sequence of emotional checkpoints. Compared to Sword Art Online's recurring pattern of Kirito entering a storyline and becoming the emotional center of it almost immediately, High School DxD feels more like a world where Issei has to continuously participate in relationships rather than passively receive them. He doesn't function as an automatic endpoint for everyone else's development. He has to actively maintain and earn those bonds through ongoing involvement. So as a harem experience, it succeeds where Sword Art Online often stumbles. It commits to its identity, keeps its tone consistent, and lets relationships feel like part of the world's ongoing chaos, rather than a predictable outcome attached to the protagonist by default. Even something like World's End Harem ends up feeling, in a strange way, more honest about what it is trying to do than Sword Art Online's approach to relationships. Because it never pretends that its premise is anything other than a setup for attraction, desire, and interpersonal chaos. The entire narrative is built around a clearly defined fantasy structure where the rules of the world exist specifically to explore that idea. You don't sit there wondering why relationships are forming or what the deeper justification is supposed to be. The premise itself is the justification. That clarity actually solves a problem Sword Art Online constantly runs into: tonal contradiction. Sword Art Online wants its relationships to feel deeply emotional, slow-burning, and meaningful, while also repeatedly relying on extremely fast emotional escalation triggered by crisis situations, proximity, or narrative necessity. So you end up questioning the foundation of the emotional beats instead of engaging with them. In contrast, a more explicitly harem-focused series doesn't need to disguise its intent. When characters form attachments, the audience already understands the lens the story is using. That means it doesn't have to overextend itself trying to convince you that every emotional development is a profound character breakthrough. It can just operate within its own defined expectations. So even if the execution is not to everyone's taste, the structure is at least consistent with its premise. It doesn't oscillate between survival drama, philosophical identity exploration, and sudden romance arcs that feel like they were triggered by proximity to the protagonist. It commits to one core idea and explores variations of it, rather than constantly switching narrative goals. That's where the contrast with Sword Art Online becomes most visible. Sword Art Online often feels like it's trying to elevate its relationship writing into something more complex than the actual storytelling infrastructure can support, whereas more straightforward harem-focused stories tend to stay within a narrower emotional and thematic range, but at least maintain consistency inside that range. And consistency matters more than ambition when it comes to whether relationships feel believable. A smaller, more focused premise that follows its own rules cleanly will often feel more coherent than a larger, more ambitious story that keeps bending its emotional logic to serve the protagonist's centrality. So the comparison isn't really about better in a moral or qualitative sense. It's about structural honesty versus structural overreach. At the end of the day, Sword Art Online just doesn't hold up when you start comparing it to what else is out there. Not because it has zero interesting ideas, it clearly does. The concept of players trapped in a death game, the blending of virtual identity and real consequence, the idea of relationships forming under pressure in artificial worlds, those are all genuinely strong starting points. On paper, that's the kind of premise you can build something memorable from. But execution matters more than premise. And that's where Sword Art Online consistently slips and fumbles. Too many arcs rely on convenience instead of consequence. Too many emotional beats feel accelerated instead of earned. Too many character relationships follow the same pattern of immediate emotional elevation around the protagonist without enough time spent on the actual process of getting there. And when a story keeps repeating that structure, it starts to feel less like organic storytelling and more like a template being reused with different skins. The result is a series that often feels like it's telling you what you're supposed to feel rather than letting those feelings develop naturally through the story itself. And once you start noticing that pattern, it becomes harder to stay immersed in what's happening, because you're no longer just watching the story, you're watching the mechanics behind it. In real life, you're not going to accidentally assemble a full harem of people just because you walked into a room and mildly helped someone once. That's not how reality works. That's how wish fulfillment works. You don't get bonus romance points for existing at medium competence levels. There's no hidden system where 5 different people suddenly develop life-altering emotional attachment because you were nearby during a crisis and said 3 vaguely supportive sentences. If anything, real-life romance is closer to buffering than a cutscene. Awkward pauses, misunderstandings, bad timing, and the crushing realization that nobody is impressed just because you know how to hold a conversation without glitching out. So no, you don't wake up one day and find yourself as the chosen protagonist of a romantic entourage. You wake up, check your messages, and realize your only route unlocked is remembering to reply to someone from 3 days ago. Sword Art Online is a fantasy. It's not realistic at all. Not just in the obvious sense of people getting trapped in a VR death game, but in how it treats people, relationships, and consequences. The world constantly bends itself around Kirito in a way that doesn't reflect how real situations or real emotions actually develop. In reality, people don't instantly form deep emotional bonds because they shared one intense experience or because someone showed up at the right moment with plot-convenient competence. Relationships take time, repetition, awkwardness, and uncertainty. Sword Art Online skips most of that and jumps straight to the result, as if emotional development is something you can fast forward through like a cutscene. Even the way conflicts resolve often feels idealized. Problems tend to align in ways that let the protagonist step in and solve them cleanly, with minimal lasting fallout or complexity. That's not how real consequences behave. They linger, complicate things, and don't neatly reset after the arc ends. So while Sword Art Online presents itself with serious stakes and dramatic tension, the way it structures its story is still firmly rooted in fantasy logic. Everything is streamlined around the protagonist, and emotional outcomes arrive faster and cleaner than real life would ever allow. Meanwhile, there are plenty of other shows that explore similar ideas with more focus, better pacing, or stronger character writing. Stories that take their time with relationships instead of rushing them. Stories that let consequences actually linger instead of resetting emotional states whenever the plot needs to move forward. Stories that commit to a tone and stick with it instead of constantly shifting between genres and emotional registers. That doesn't mean Sword Art Online has no audience or no appeal. It clearly connected with a lot of viewers for a reason. But popularity isn't the same thing as consistency, and nostalgia isn't the same thing as strong writing. So if the goal is just entertainment, there's nothing wrong with liking it. But if the goal is to engage with well-structured storytelling, especially when it comes to character relationships and emotional development, there are simply better options out there. And once you've seen how cleanly those better-structured stories can handle similar ideas, it becomes a lot harder not to notice where Sword Art Online cuts corners. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like and subscribe for more Sword Art Online breakdowns, critiques, and deep dives into why this show keeps tripping over its own ideas. And yeah, there's plenty more where that came from. Because once you start noticing the patterns in Sword Art Online's writing, how it handles relationships, how it escalates emotional stakes, how it keeps circling back to the same protagonist-centered structure, it's basically impossible not to see it everywhere in the series. So if you want more analysis, more rants, and more of this kind of no-nonsense look at why certain story choices don't really hold up under scrutiny, stick around. There's a lot more to talk about. And as always, thanks for watching.